There is a number that travels through casual conversation about ancient human life with remarkable confidence. Ancient people lived to about 30. You've heard it. You've probably repeated it. It has the satisfying ring of a fact that has been checked. It is technically accurate. It is also almost entirely misleading. And the gap between those two things is where the actually interesting history lives. Because the image this number produces, a worn-out, gray-haired 30-year-old hunter-gatherer experiencing what everyone around them treats as a perfectly unremarkable death from old age, is not what ancient human life looked like, not even close. The real explanation for why that number is so low is both more precise and considerably darker than simple early aging. And untangling it changes how you understand not just the ancient past, but what modern medicine has actually accomplished. So let's take the number apart. The first thing to understand is the difference between two statistics that sound similar, but describe completely different realities: life expectancy at birth and life expectancy conditional on surviving childhood. Life expectancy at birth is an average. It takes every person born into a population, including everyone who died in their first hour, their first week, their first year, and averages their ages at death across the entire group. This average is extraordinarily sensitive to infant and child mortality. When large numbers of children die very young, they pull the average down so dramatically that the resulting number tells you almost nothing about how long adults actually lived. Here is a thought experiment that makes this concrete. Imagine a population of 10 people. 5 die before their 5th birthday. The other 5 survive childhood and live to 70. What is the average life expectancy at birth? You add the ages at death, 5 deaths at roughly age 2, 5 deaths at age 70, and divide by 10. The answer is approximately 36 years. But look at what that number hides. Half this population lived to 70. Nobody died of old age at 36. The statistic corresponds to the actual experience of essentially nobody in the group. This is, in simplified form, precisely what is happening with ancient life expectancy figures. The low average is driven overwhelmingly by catastrophic childhood mortality, not by adults collapsing in early middle age. The honest statistic is life expectancy conditional on reaching adulthood. When researchers calculate this for hunter-gatherer populations, the picture transforms. Adults who survived childhood had reasonable expectations of living into their 60s and 70s. That is not a minor correction. That is a fundamentally different story. So why was childhood mortality so catastrophically high? This is where the genuinely dark substance of the question lives. Infectious disease is the largest single category, but the specific pattern is more complicated than people expect. Hunter-gatherers living in small, mobile, dispersed groups were actually relatively protected from many of the epidemic diseases that became major killers later in human history. Smallpox, measles, bubonic plague. These diseases required dense population density and sustained close contact to maintain transmission chains. In a small nomadic band, an outbreak burns through the available hosts and collapses before it can sustain itself. The agricultural revolution made this dramatically worse, not better. Dense settlements, domesticated animals serving as reservoirs for new diseases, contaminated water from concentrated waste, farming created exactly the conditions epidemic disease requires to flourish. The move to agriculture solved food security problems while substantially increasing infectious disease mortality. The two changes did not arrive together as a simple package of improvements. Childbirth mortality represents the second major category, operating on two populations simultaneously: mothers and infants. Estimates for pre-modern populations place the risk of a woman dying from childbirth complications at somewhere between 1 and 2% per birth. That sounds modest. It is not. A woman who gave birth 8 times across her life at even a conservative 1% mortality risk per birth,
accumulated a cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth exceeding 5 to 8%. Something like 1 in 12 to 1 in 15 women in some historical populations could expect to eventually die as a direct consequence of pregnancy or delivery. The causes were grimly consistent across cultures: hemorrhage during or after delivery, post-delivery infection, obstructed labor with no surgical remedy available, and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy that remain dangerous even with modern medicine and were essentially untreatable before it. Infant and child mortality operated through an even broader range of mechanisms. Estimates for pre-modern populations suggest that 30 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood, with most of those deaths concentrated in the first 2 years of life. Birth complications, infectious disease in bodies with immature immune systems, malnutrition during scarcity, and the simple physical fragility of very young children combined to produce mortality rates that are genuinely difficult to internalize from a modern vantage point. These are the deaths driving the famous number downward, not adults aging rapidly, children who never reached adulthood at all. Violence and environmental hazards constitute two further categories, though their contributions vary considerably across populations and periods. Archaeological evidence of skeletal trauma suggests that interpersonal violence and conflict between groups accounted for a meaningful proportion of adult male deaths in some prehistoric societies, with some estimates ranging as high as 10 to 20% of adult male mortality in specific populations, though other researchers dispute whether these sites are representative of the broader picture. Accidents and environmental hazards, falls, animal attacks, drowning, exposure, contributed additional mortality in a world where a broken leg or a deep wound carried consequences that modern medicine has made almost unimaginable. Which brings us to the single most underappreciated factor in this entire story: antibiotics. It is genuinely difficult to overstate what antibiotics changed. Before them, a minor wound that became infected could progress to sepsis and death within days. Childbirth infections killed women who had survived the delivery itself. Pneumonia following a common cold could be fatal. Surgical wounds routinely became lethal. Throughout virtually the entire span of human history, right up to the mid-20th century, infections that a modern clinic resolves with a 10-day prescription represented genuine mortal threats. The gap between ancient and modern mortality is not primarily a story about ancient bodies being weaker. It is a story about the specific tools available to address dangers that have always existed. Now, with all of that established, what did actual adult aging look like for the substantial portion of the population that survived childhood? The archaeological and ethnographic evidence here is genuinely striking. Skeletal remains from individuals who reached advanced age in prehistoric populations show clear evidence of the same age-related changes affecting modern elderly people: osteoarthritis, dental wear, healed fractures, evidence of osteoporosis. Contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, studied extensively by anthropologists, consistently include individuals living well into their 70s and occasionally beyond. These elderly individuals are not marginal presences in their communities. They occupy important roles as repositories of accumulated practical knowledge, as caregivers for grandchildren, as sources of social authority. This matters evolutionarily. There is an explanatory framework called the grandmother hypothesis that addresses exactly this point. It argues that post-reproductive women who survived into old age provided meaningful fitness benefits to their descendants through childcare, food provisioning, and knowledge transmission, benefits substantial enough to have driven the evolution of an extended post-reproductive lifespan in humans. This pattern, unique among mammals, only makes evolutionary sense if long-lived grandmothers were a real and recurring feature of human populations across deep history. Evolution does not preserve traits that are never expressed. The very existence of human menopause and extended post-reproductive life is powerful evidence that our species has always been capable of producing substantial numbers of genuinely old people. There is also a methodological problem embedded in the archaeological data itself. Determining age at death from skeletal remains relies on biological markers, growth plate fusion, dental wear, bone density changes. These techniques become progressively less precise for older individuals. For decades, the standard practice was to categorize all adults above roughly 50 into a single broad group, without further discrimination. This created a systematic distortion. If a skeletal population includes individuals who actually died at 65, 75, or 80, but the methodology can only confidently place them into a vague older adult category, any life expectancy calculation built on that data will underestimate how long adults actually lived. Subsequent reanalyses of several major skeletal collections using improved aging methods have consistently found older and longer-lived populations than the original analyses suggested. Comparative data from living hunter-gatherer populations reinforces this. Research compiling demographic data across multiple traditional societies found a consistent pattern: high mortality concentrated in the first years of life, substantial survival through adolescence and prime adulthood, then a gradual increase in mortality beginning around age 40 to 50. The modal adult age of death, the single most common outcome for an adult who survived childhood, clustered consistently around 70 to 72 years. The most statistically typical outcome for an adult hunter-gatherer who cleared the threshold of early childhood was not dying at 30, it was living into their 7th decade. This reframes what modern medicine has actually accomplished, and the reframing matters. The achievement is not that we have extended the maximum potential human lifespan dramatically beyond what was biologically possible before. Long adult lifespans into the 70s and beyond were always within human biological range. The actual achievement is more specific. We have dramatically reduced the proportion of any population that fails to reach adulthood, that dies of infections that are now routinely treatable, that dies from injuries that once progressed to fatal outcomes without intervention. We have not meaningfully raised the ceiling of human lifespan, we have raised the floor. The number 30 is not wrong. It captures something real and genuinely dark about the scale of childhood and maternal mortality across most of human history. It simply does not capture what most people assume it captures, which is that ancient adults aged rapidly and died young as a matter of biological destiny. They did not. The adults who survived childhood faced their own formidable array of dangers, but the ones who cleared those dangers found themselves in bodies capable of living long lives, because those bodies were the same ones we are running now. What changed is not the hardware, it is how aggressively the world was trying to kill it.